Good evening and welcome to tonight's Dallas Architecture Forum lecture with distinguished architect Bernard Tschumi of Bernard Tschumi Architects. My name is Maria Gomez, a member of the Forum's Board of Directors, and on behalf of the entire board, welcome. We are grateful that you have joined us virtually for this lecture. This lecture is also our annual Bob James Memorial Lecture. We honor Bob's enduring legacy and his outstanding contributions to the architecture profession. The Forum expresses appreciation to the ADEX Foundation and to JHP Architecture and Urban Design for their support of the Bob James Memorial Lecture. I'm sure we will be inspired by Bernard's presentation of the firm's significant body of work. At the end of the lecture, you will have the opportunity to submit questions for him via the Zoom Q&A function. Thank you again for joining us, and I am pleased to ask Jean Udaly to recognize this evening's sponsors and update us on the Forum's spring events.
Thank you, Maria. The Forum is grateful to our lecture season sponsors, Maharger Development, Reggie Graham, and Smink Art and Design. We appreciate our series sponsors, Architectural Lighting Alliance, Bentley Tibbs Architect, Baudron Fruit, Eggersman, HDR Architecture, Headington Companies, HKS, Modern Dallas, and O'Brien Architects. We thank ADEX Foundation and JHP Architecture for their support of the Bob James Memorial Lecture. Thanks as well to our lecture sponsor, Perkins & Will. And now I'll turn this over to Forum board member Ron Stelmarski, who will introduce our speaker. Ron?
Thank you, Jean, and good evening, everyone. It is both humbling and a major honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker, architect, thinker, and provocateur, Bernard Tschumi, FAIA and RIBA. Widely recognized as one of the leading architects in practice today, he is the founding principal of Bernard Tschumi Architects, with studios in New York City and Paris. It feels a little difficult to introduce someone that has so directly informed my personal view of architecture, but Bernard has been a critical force in the fields of architecture and design for decades, and I will touch on this range of influence. The intertwining concepts of event and movement in architecture are supported by Tschumi's belief that architecture is the most important innovation of our time. And I don't think you're going to find many of us who argue that. But Tschumi also references other disciplines in his work, such as literature and film, proving that architecture must participate in culture's polemics and question its foundations. First known as a theorist, he drew attention to his innovative architectural practice when he won the prestigious competition for the Parc de la Villette, a 125-acre cultural park based on activities as much as nature. Other major built works include the Acropolis Museum, Lafrenois Center for the Contemporary Arts, the Paris Zoo, the Binhai Science Museum, and a large educational complex for the University of Paris Sud, scheduled to open later this year. Tschumi studied in Paris and at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, and has held teaching positions at the Architectural Association in London, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, Princeton University, as well as the Cooper Union. He was Dean of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University in New York from 1988 to 2003. Now, there are many books devoted to Tschumi's writings in architectural practice, including Architecture Concepts, Red is Not a Color, which I believe is the most comprehensive collection of his conceptual and built work, the amazing and equally massive 4-part Event Cities series, and the book Architecture in Disjunction. Now, the wall of books behind me is not staged, but you can see the Tschumi shelf. It's always close at hand and has been a great source of inspiration throughout my career. I still hold pretty tightly to my original copy of Questions of Space. But his drawings and models are equally important enough such that they're in the collections of several major museums, including MoMA in New York and the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which presented a major retrospective of his work in 2014. And this introduction and lecture are personally very meaningful to me. Bernard was one of my earliest architectural influences. I remember being introduced to his work through the Manhattan Transcripts and the advertisements for architecture, really shifting my design sensibilities toward concept, content, and context in a very eye-opening way. I was then lucky enough a few years later to collaborate on a piece of one of his projects, the University of Cincinnati Athletics Center, specifically the museum component. Bernard might not remember this, but I would tote a sizable model to his New York studio every month or two, and after the uncrating and the presenting of new ideas, I would sort of lean back and wait for the critiques and conversations to ensue. So Bernard, thank you for speaking with us tonight, and welcome to the Dallas Architecture Forum.
Thank you for this very kind introduction and this very amusing introduction, because I was extremely flattered to notice as you were talking that indeed you had that shelf with book that I could recognize. And of course, it's quite pleasant to see that things travel. And to speak tonight in Dallas at a distance is really part of the life we live in, where somehow the conventional way to look at architecture as a place has completely changed as we live in different places at the same time, where the idea of movement and the idea of dialogue is actually something quite different. And so I'm ecstatic to have that opportunity to discuss this with you tonight. And I'm going to try to show a number of excerpts of work. Some of them actually that were just mentioned in the introduction, and to show that architecture is actually an endeavor. It's a constant discovery, but it's also a constant experiment. And so what I intend to do is first make a general point, which is that architecture is not simply about form, but it's also a form of knowledge. And you learn how to apprehend the world through the work that you do as an architect. So let me start with a few images, and I'll do something which is relatively, how can I say, chronological, but somehow which also describe a, how could I say, a path, a way to go from the most abstract to the most, how could I describe it, to the most realistic and even prosaic. So let's start. So as I mentioned, architecture is not so much a knowledge of form as a form of knowledge. Architecture is quite amazing because it's about spaces, but it's also about movement, it's also about material. And I'm showing you this image because it had struck me years and years ago, at the very early, before I had built anything. And I looked at this image of the GM Pavilion at, I guess, the 1964 New York World's Fair. And I looked at the crowd and I looked at the ramps, and I started to ask myself, which was the generator? Were the people generating the ramp or the ramp generating the crowd? And this relation between movement and architecture became really a starting point of the early work. I was fascinated by different disciplines that were using diagrams in order to express that idea of dynamic mobility. So if I just take those 4 diagrams, one is about pageants in the 16th century. Right below it is a fantastic diagram by Oskar Schlemmer showing a dance, the movement of the dancer. On the top right, you won't believe it, but it's a kitchen diagram of the ideal kitchen and for the ideal housewife. It's not very popular today, but interesting in this era. And then the bottom one, those of you who are sport-minded, I'm sure there are plenty in the audience, is a diagram for football notation. So these diagrams were somehow something that I thought were not necessarily included in most of the architectural plans and sections. And interestingly enough, I found in first by chance and after that through research that some filmmakers had devised mode of notation that could express several sensibility at the same time, whether the visual one or whether what you hear. In other words, if you look at this like a music partition, you have the shots which eventually become a part of the film, the music score, the way the camera movements are, etc., etc. I found that absolutely fascinating. By the way, this is from a filmmaker, the early avant-garde of the cinema in the 1920s, Sergei Eisenstein in the film Alexander Nevsky. And so I try to do the same thing with architecture. In other words, could one express the event, the action, what happens, a diagram of the section, a diagram of the plan, and then, of course, the movement vectors. And this research was quite fascinating because it was actually liberating. It was allowing you to think fresh about what happens in a space as well as what movements are. And that's how the Manhattan Transcripts started. In other words, a book of theoretical projects at a time when other discussions were happening, which were much more historicist, which were talking about rediscovering the 19th or the 18th century. This was very, very different. And a mode of notation was explored upon. In other words, again, that idea that there is movement, there is plan, and there is action, there is an event. And the architectural part is presented as a space, and then the movement vectors, and then a whole series of variation. I'm not going to go in detail in that, but trying to explain that this event, space, and movement, the trilogy, was very, very important in the early work, and still now still plays a role. And it's developed in a different series of episodes. The second episode, if the first episode was about a park, the second episode was on a street, 42nd Street in New York. Every time there was a program, but the program was like in a detective story. There was a murder, there was a chase, but always using this device of this trilogy of the photograph that depicted the action, or the program, if you want, the section, and the plan, which showed some elements of the park, of the movement. And so each of these, the third episode is about a tower and the fall in the tower. The last one is a block. And here you see again on the square on the right, on the left, you see the movement vectors of the different characters and how the movement is solidified into a wall, and then from the positive it becomes a negative, and somehow the work starts to use those three parts, movement, event, and space, as the generator of the project. Simultaneously, that's probably what you can do when you are really starting. You don't know much, and you take incredible chances, and people ask you to do things that you would never have thought about. And so I was asked to do a series of constructions. In other words, they were very much derived from what you would call artist site-specific structures. And this one was taken from a film, Staircase from Scarface, And then it led to a series of potential small buildings, which were really experimental tests about the combination of different parts, sometimes literally taken from the environment you lived in. It's taken from gables, from existing roofs, and so on. And so several of these were built, generally constructed with my own hands, with some help or not. And that was, in a sense, the early understanding, and we'll see that a fair amount tonight, the early understanding that you cannot separate architecture from movement and then from materiality, from materials. So when I say that architecture is the materialization of concept, is that if a concept is an abstract idea, architecture is very particular because much of its reference point, it's about materials. In other words, how do you materialize an idea? If you're mathematicians, you stay within mathematics. If you are a musician, you stay within music. But in architecture, you start with very abstract thoughts and then you try to build them. That's fascinating. So the Parc de la Villette was at one moment, I thought, well, let's test it. Let's do a competition. Very large industrial site that was to be demolished mostly, and a competition, a very large open competition. There were nearly 500 competitors, anonymous, presenting a series of ideas. And of course, you can think about the 18th century, the park, the neoclassical one, or the 19th century, Olmsted-like, or the 20th century, Le Corbusier. And then I was interested in that idea of a 21st century park, and looking at precedents, looking at large, models or diagrams of large-scale organizations. And you can have the grid, you can have the concentric circles, you have Baroque axes, you have every possible thing. I was really interested in the one before last, the Le Corbusier Plan Voisin, because it's a plan that everybody hates. And I thought, if everybody hates that plan, maybe there's something interesting about it. I tested some of these different diagrams and applied them to the site. We still work in the office, we still work like that. We never start with one concept or one idea. We test a series of possibilities and their permutations. So the bottom right was that point grid, and the point grid became the starting point of the project, and immediately suggested that one could work in ways which was not so traditional. In other words, this drawing, which is a competition drawing, shows sequences at first. In other words, the idea of movement, a little bit like a film script or a film sequence. And then at the bottom, a drawing, which is the competition one, but I'll show you the more recent one after that, of that series, that exploded axonometric of lines, points, and surfaces. Now, the reason I show this drawing, imagine today, in 2022, anybody showing a drawing like that for the design of a park, you'd be thrown out immediately. Nobody would believe that has anything to do with nature. In reality, nature is also a construction, and the projects one, and this idea of superimposed system, in other words, the movement vectors at the top, the points of activities in the center, and the movement vector, the surfaces that people can appropriate at the bottom, were very much the starting point of the project. So it was not only about the red points, it was the superimposition of those three systems, each with their logic, each with their rationality, and then they would be turned into materials. And so I'm not going to go through the really adventurous and polemical and even rising of a situation of an architect who had never built anything, trying to get it done together. I think I went through 4 prime ministers, 2 presidents. It works. This juxtaposition of real life and the juxtaposition of red buildings and 19th century neoclassical buildings and the rest of the city was a fascinating experience. In other words, that you could, as an architect, use architecture to trigger life, to trigger events, to trigger a certain way to develop a potential new lifestyle. And that fascinated me. So the movement notation took a lot of different ways. In other words, movement can be fast, can be slow, can be interrupted. And that's exactly what this diagram did. And then you translate it into something that is closer to what you're going to build. And then you build it. You often have to devise new materials. In this particular case, a certain type of terrazzo that would allow us to do the curvatures, or of course you see on the far left the folly at a distance. You may have a surprise at the end. I will show it to you again. So I've used the word program, but the word program is not necessarily a neutral word. You can play with words. You can do what I call trans-programming or cross-programming. And so I remember in a magazine, this collage, which was putting that sign in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. And I found it really very interesting that sort of strange disjunction between the potential program and the connotation of the architecture itself was suggesting a way which architecture really never think about so much, and architects. In other words, that you can act upon the program in order to develop an architectural concept. For a very large competition, again, for the library, the main National Library of France, I was fascinated with the idea that it was all about circuits, that you have circuits of books, circuits of people, and circuits of exhibition, and these could potentially become something that would be the starting point of the project, whereby in the library, you could have a circuit of a running track. And namely, the idea of the running track was that it would intersect the reading rooms, so that the athlete of the 20th century, well, at the time, late 20th century or early 21st century, would be an intellectual, and the intellectual would be an athlete. Of course, we were kicked out of the competition. We lost after the first round. Nevertheless, it was a very interesting first experiment. This I will leave aside. Maybe the reason why I have this slide, we are at a period when there are no computers then. Everything is done with models, with photographs, with small airbrush and models. Totally different ways to work. But interestingly enough, the fact that it's not hyper-realistic, the fact that you have to invent the medium allows you to become much freer with the way to develop thinking. Old and new. As you can see already, I'm very interested in those oppositions, those circumstances that seems totally uncreative, like a building that was destined to receive its had received its demolition permit. I went to visit it just to see the site. The program was to be a center for a sort of electronic Bauhaus that would use the most up-to-date medium to encourage artists to invent new modes of production. So I went to see it, and I discovered that roof, which was quite strange, sort of interesting in its geometry, and inside extremely large open spaces, which actually were much bigger than what my budget was going to allow me to do for that center of contemporary art. So it occurred to me that maybe all we needed to do was to protect those buildings, because indeed, if they had received their demolition permit, is the fact that they were actually not going to resist the weight of snow. So I thought, let's protect them, and something very interesting started to happen. Is that in the relationship between the building next door, the old buildings, and the buildings underneath, suddenly there was a sort of interesting dialogue, a continuity, which was suggested that you could have old and new at the same time. And that superimposition of the new envelope would, in a way, bypassing one of the big discussions that happened, that was in the at the turn of the century, let's put it this way, when you had preservationists who were saying that you had to be contextual and do things that would look exactly like the existing building next door. And I never liked that idea. I liked the idea of dialogue, and as a result, much more interesting in establishing a dialogue between old and new, between the 20th or the 21st century and things that had been built much before. And then it also was a way to make those existing buildings have a second life. And so in the new skin, of course, you have all those things like fire stairs and air conditioning and all these, but it's not about form. It's really about the idea that you can just it's a sort of collage form of thought, of bringing on one hand the existing building. This is what you see in the dotted line, and then in red are places that that artists can use in order to do performances or to do films and so on, and then cover it up with a new roof. And together, when you look at it, you have, in a sense, no design. You just have a strategy. In other words, you have a roof over existing building, and in between, an extraordinary space, a residual space that can be appropriated, that can be taken over, and that can become really a place of invention. So that then you have whatever budget you have, this you don't have to pay for it because it's an empty space. And this is one of those fascinating moments when you realize that a concept, a strategy, is actually something which is eminently feasible. Amusingly enough, this is one of the very first 3D computer rendering that one had at the time. We're talking about the early 90s of, in other words, over 25 years ago, nearly 30 years ago. So this idea of using a concept and to reverse obvious expectation, in other words, what we also call the dictionary of received ideas, was the starting point of a request by a small town in the north of the Netherlands to do a pavilion for music and video. And so I thought, well, normally everybody thought that it would be something that would be completely obscure, in other words, video, I thought, no, we can do it in glass, and we can make it in glass in such a way that it's entirely transparent. The technology at the time had made it possible to have enough luminosity, so to make it as a place which would be visible to the population of the town, and it would become a public building in the small city of Groningen. I'm not going to go into the detail of why it is at an angle and why it is slightly warped. The reason, yes, I'll say, is that the images were fascinating in the video, and I was trying to destabilize the viewer as he or she was visiting the space. Now, what is fascinating is that the building, after the Festival of Music and Film, that was supposed to be unbuilt. It was to be demolished. But people in the town liked it so much that they decided to make it as an art center and have a series of installation by artists once or twice a year. And here I show you some of the images. So to show that architecture is an incentive, and then it's an incentive for events, for unexpected moments to take place. Some of the reinvention of the program, because again, program and architecture cannot be separated from one another. So architecture is not only what it looks like, but what it does. The issue, we all architects are envelope makers. We have to keep the rain out, right? If you're doing a concert hall, you have to keep the noise out from the cars or whatever is outside, and you have to keep the noise from getting out and disturb your neighbors. So that idea that you had two envelopes, one inner envelope and one outer one, became quite interesting. That's a sort of like a construction photograph during showing like an X-ray, the inner envelope, which is made of concrete, and the ribs of the outer envelope, which is made of steel. Now, what is interesting about this double envelope is that when I talk about materiality, is that the dialogue between the two is also the place that generates the architecture. The concrete interior, which is partly poured in place and partly precast, and the outside envelope start to establish a very interesting dialogue that when the concert happens, people use this space as the space of movement. Now we're back to the very beginning when I said that architecture is about space and movement. This is exactly what happens. Now, materials are so important because if you play on a dialogue of steel and concrete, how you're going to do the seat? And the seats, I didn't want to use steel or concrete, and so we made them transparent, and they are transparent plastic, and they act before the stage starts, act as a sort of luminous, translucent sort of reality. So again, architecture is the materialization of ideas or concept. Very soon after that particular concert hall was extremely successful and popular, we were asked to do another one, but in a forest, which was quite different from the sort of rather dreary highways of the first building. It was in a beautiful 200 years old sort of park. And we thought, how can we do it using exactly the same concept? The requirements were similar, but using different materials. And here, instead of using concrete and wood, concrete and steel, I said, well, let's use wood for the inside and transparent polycarbonate on the outside. So this is actually the same building, or almost. But the difference between the experience that you have while going through the building is entirely different. And this is, again, a fascinating part of architecture, is that with very little means, you can really completely transform reality. And that's the insight. See the difference between the translucent seats early on and the wood ones in that particular case. So that idea of playing with keeping the concept but changing the context or vice versa is quite fascinating in order to understand, again, that starting point that I mentioned, architecture as a form of knowledge. Here you see again those two buildings, which are really the same one, but two different worlds. Now, montage and architecture. I talked about that difference between program and space, architecture and context. And I talked a little bit earlier about montage and cinema. There was quite a challenge for generations. In Athens is a building that everybody knows all over the world, which is, of course, the Parthenon at the top of the Acropolis. It's one of the foundation of Western civilization. It has all sort of unusual characteristic, and a museum was planned right nearby, and I was struck by the site itself. They told you, well, this is your site, and here I said, but that's full of archaeological remnants. What can we do? And they said, well, that's the problem. So looking at it, looking at what had to be there, because there was another challenge, is that the famous frieze that used to be in the Parthenon is now mostly at the British Museum. So one of the requirements was to design a building that would convince the Brits to return the marbles to Athens. Not that simple. So we started to think, how do you compete with one of the most famous monument of, as I said, of Western civilization? How do you deal with the leftover archaeological pieces, and how do you convince the return that the marble should return to Athens? Now, what I find interesting is that context was not my choice. It was there. It's very often the case for architects. We don't choose the context, it's there, but we can choose the concept. So in this particular case, it seems to be clear enough. You had one part that had to relate to the Parthenon, another part which had to relate to the ruins, to the archaeological ruins, and in between there were a number of fantastic sculptures that had to be located. So the project was devised into those three layers. You can see that I'm interested often about this superimposition of different parts. It's not only about juxtaposition, it's also in 3 dimensions. And then also arriving at these simple diagrams that becomes the building itself. In other words, the lower part protects the ruins, the upper part relates to the Parthenon. We'll see why it does so in a minute. And in between, you have the generally extraordinary set of sculptures from 2,500 years ago. At night, again, that superimposition in a way relate to the superimposition of the existing Acropolis, the hill, and the Parthenon itself. And you can see in the upper layer of the new building, in the transparency, you can see something quite interesting that I'm going to show you in a minute. Here you see the two buildings, the Parthenon in the background or at the top, and the museum at the bottom. You notice one thing in particular is that the rectangle of the Parthenon is identical to the rectangle of the top rectangle of the museum. However, the base of the museum is parallel to two of the streets of the existing 19th and 20th century Athens. In other words, two logics that are completely different, but allow a strange geometry to take place that people started to say, Bernard is a deconstructivist. No, I was a contextualist. I was playing with what was there, and indeed now revealing the ruins. In other words, the building is entirely built on stilt. There's a whole lecture that one could make about earthquakes and construction. You see, I was very proud of inventing that column, which I call the tripartite column. In other words, it has the main sort of center of the column itself, and then it divides into three parts in order to increase stability while protecting the existing ruins. This, of course, was quite a spectacle, and much glass was used so that people could see this superimposition of these three realities. And again, the idea of the movement vectors was crucial in order to develop a narrative. Museums are fascinating because they tend to be simultaneously about spaces and about stories. So, and then the atrium inside, which is mostly for circulation, but you could see people walking over your head, going through this set of that forest of columns and those extraordinary marble statues where the materiality, again, architecture as the materialization of concept, the concrete was intentionally kept relatively rough in order to absorb the light, while the light would be reflected on the marble of the statues. So here, with very little means, no theatrics, it's just simply the floor and is white marble from the same actually as the statues, but of course, just excavated. And then the extraordinary statues, which have beautifully aged over 2,500 years, and then the forest of column. Similar dialogue between the big hall in the center with the caryatides and the dots which are a motif that comes here, have actually a very functional role. They play acoustical absorption. And then when you get to the top, the glass box at the top of the museum, then you see that extraordinary frieze, the same as I mentioned, was at the most of it was at the British Museum. This is actually a fragment that was still at the Acropolis on the Parthenon at the time. So these are the originals. And so this fascination about what this is that you cannot look at it as a tableau, as a static work of art. You have to walk along it. And the fascinating thing is that it reminded me that drawing that I showed you at the beginning of the Manhattan Transcript, that drawings were 32 feet long. And the only way to look at it was to walk along it, not unlike the frieze. So in a sense, these interests start to come all together. Another example, on the right, you have the photograph of the frieze, but on the left, I mentioned that filmmaker, that early 20th century Russian avant-garde filmmaker who made a film which nobody had realized was actually based on the frieze of the Parthenon. And he wrote at that time a fantastic article called Montage and Architecture. Again, I don't have time to get into details, but the idea that actually architecture and montage have one common denominator. It's the idea of movement. Fragments, of course, it becomes a little surreal. The reality becomes, better than any concept you could have. I'll go very quickly now through a couple other projects. Talking about now the idea of form. As you've noticed, I very rarely talk about form. I even sort of tend to be mistrustful. At the same time, in nature or anywhere else, in industry and so on, you have extraordinary sort of configurations. And sometimes they may be the starting point for a project. And here for a museum, which is in Burgundy, in France, we were asked to do a museum for a famous battle between the Gauls and the Romans. And I chose to make it into two separate buildings rather, one a center of interpretation on the left, a museum on the right. The one on the left is made mostly of wood with trees growing on it. And the other one is made of stone. Why? Because it is actually over quarry, and I use the stone from the quarry. The geometry is always an interesting one. The cylinder has no facade. It's constantly dynamic. It turns around. And this is the actual, the first of the two buildings has been completed. And what you see, which is particular, is that envelope, that double envelope, which is made of wood, of a heavy sort of wood members that in a way filter the light. It's sort of, is a building, but it's not quite a building. You can have a very conventional sort of offices or museum sort of galleries, but at the same time, the building has a life of its own and filters the light from and protects it from the sun. Inside, playing again the game of materials, the sequence of visitors go through here concrete and of course moves towards, as I mentioned with the Acropolis Museum, all museums tend to be a circuit, tend to be a movement. And this is quite fascinating because you can really develop a particular vocabulary. Now, this is a very orderly building in a way. It has a predictable geometry, but very soon after that, we were asked to do new buildings for the Paris Zoo. And I had been fascinated by these issues that with zoo, you don't know who is in and who is out, whether it's the animals looking at people or people looking at the animals. And we developed something whereby all the architecture for the people is made of what you would normally see for the animals. In other words, the entrance area is like an aviary. It's exactly built in the same way. Here it is. But then the place for other animals like the rhinos or the hippopotamus or the giraffes was using the same wood members as the one we used for the museum in Burgundy, except we use them in a very different, disorderly, random manner, or apparently random manner. It's interesting, you see how wood ages, it becomes like gray, like concrete. and creates a fascinating sort of very natural and at the same time very contemporary thing. This is an image as the wood has not yet got gray, and it's fascinating that evolution of something which is very simple as a double envelope again, but that starts to play with its circumstances here. What is the symbolical dimension of a zoo? So I'll show very quick images. And again, here, extraordinary photograph by the very good Iwan Baan, Dutch photograph here. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say through this quick talk is that concept, not form, is what distinguishes architecture from the mere building. That's, by the way, my favorite client. Her name is Adeline, and she stayed during construction in the zoo all the time. Now, I'll move towards the last project, a very large museum in China, where on the site before construction started, with the most polluted environment you can imagine, a museum was to replace it, a museum of industry. We were fascinated by the idea of those extraordinary machines that you see in industrial architecture, and started to look, and again, I'm going fast because time is restricted, trying to develop a concept through, again, those diagrams that I like to do, trying to develop the fact that at La Villette, we had a series of solids, of spot, and here we were going to make voids and to carve into a solid a series of voids, a series of spaces, which somehow were reminiscent of industrial chimneys, and develop a very large museum. It's approximately 600 feet long and 120 feet high, and the size is huge. Look, this is a superimposition of the museum, the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and the building in Tianjin. Tianjin is an hour south of Beijing, and the whole development was trying to bring up this concept of industrial architecture, but turning it into a place which would be a major museum. So I'll go very fast. Fascinating, the issue of representation. Look, this is one of the first diagram, then a next still diagram with computers, and then you get to be a little more precise, and then this is the final built building. This is built, that's not a diagram. Or you draw this at first, then you draw this, and then you draw this, and then this is the built. No, this is actually, I get fooled myself. This is a last rendering, and this is the final building itself. In other words, something very strange happens today about the fact that you start with incredibly impressive materials, such as here, it's a steel building, which have an incredible presence, and this you cannot imagine through hyper-realist drawing. You have to sit. Now, some of the views of the building as completed. This is not a rendering. This is the outside, the anodized metal skin, and the building itself playing a little bit with that pixelation, but so that's innocent. So that's all I wanted to show you today, with perhaps just one teaser. A building under construction right now, a huge 1 million square feet building for the Paris University. That's some of the view where architecture becomes urbanism, the building under construction. So if I come back to Dallas, I'll show it to you one day. And then to finish it, I'm going to show you, after the million square feet building, the smallest building we've ever done, which we just completed about a month ago. And this is a tiny ticket booth nested under one of the follies. I'm very proud of it. It's 250 square feet. Here it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard. It's been an amazing overview of your body of work, which is just inspiring, educational, informative, and I think challenging to cause us all to think in a different way to broaden our perspective. So thank you so much for your talk. We only have one question that we have time for, so I'll ask it quickly. The question is, what is the status of the IFCA project in the Dominican Republic?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Unfortunately, that's the fate of all architects. We design buildings, we design cities, we invent things, and then the economy moves around, and the building, the whole project was abandoned. The sponsor had other priorities, and although I'm very proud of that project, no, it never happened.
No, thank you. I'm sure if I opened up the floor for more questions, we'd be here for several hours. So we really can't, but there's one more. This will be the last one. It says, will you comment on the current condition of architectural education? That could be a whole lecture, but just a brief answer, please.
Oh, I want to give that lecture, but I don't know when. And the reason why I say I don't know when, I think architectural education is not separate from the architectural reality of our times. And I think we are currently in what I would describe as a period of transition, is that some of the realities and the certainties and the way we built, which were the way we built throughout the 20th century, is in constant questioning. But we don't have yet the answer. In other words, the whole discussion, for example, say climate change and other issues of the economy, just taking what we are all living about these days, wearing these, is all part of the question that you're just asking me. So I think at the moment, it's not education on its own, it's also the role of architects. And that's a fascinating moment we're living in.
Yes, yes. Fascinating, challenging, but exciting times. Again, thank you, Bernard. Thanks to all of our sponsors who made this lecture possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for just an incredible overview of Bernard's work and his critical thinking that I think influences all of us. So again, thank you and good night.